Sorry, cut off again. My 10 minutes was up. So let's go at it again. I was in the middle of explaining to you that why I don't think Socrates was a made-up character. There's a bust of Socrates and there's a bust of Plato, and they're different. And certainly somebody could invent that, but scholars went through an era where they were questioning the existence of everybody. They doubt that William Shakespeare actually lived and wrote his plays. I think it was a pen name, or In the late 1800s, they questioned whether David actually wrote the Psalms and whether David was actually a real character or the combination of several characters. And scholars they live to ask questions, and they never seem to be able to find answers. So anyway, I believe that Socrates actually lived. Plato would sit in on his debates and discussions, would record those, or he had scribes recording them. He would edit that and put it together, and so he has Plato's Republic essentially is a collection of all of the different debates and so on, many of them involving Socrates, but also involving others. Socrates the most famous. Most of what we know of him, again, from Plato. He and Plato preferred dialectic to rhetoric. So in other words, they preferred logic to rhetoric. Dialectic is the faculty of discovering available arguments to answer proposed questions. You might recognize that because when we talked about the definition, Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, it was a similar definition. I'll come to that in a minute. In dialectic, you are finding what arguments work. In rhetoric, you are choosing arguments which prove, or, and this was Socrates' problem with it, appear to prove a point. Socrates didn't like that. He wanted things to be proven and airtight proofs, which really is unreasonable. But I'll say that his error from 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago, is still with us today. We still insist that it can't be proven unless we have mathematical certainty, which simply is not the case. Now, the other philosophical rhetoric was Aristotle, the other philosophical rhetorician. I got going too fast. Was Aristotle. Aristotle wrote book 1, 2, and 3 of his rhetoric, and it is the textbook for the teaching of rhetoric. Every other rhetoric textbook owes most of its work to Aristotle, and everything after that referred back to it. Aristotle codified, and that's why we'll have you reading Aristotle this year. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BC. Philip of Macedon, Macedonia. Philip of Macedon, the mighty conqueror of Greece, hired Aristotle to teach his son. So Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. He lived during the intertestamental period. Aristotle was sent to Athens at the age of 17 after his father died. He joined the academy where he continued for 20 years. He was a student of Plato, but he did not follow Plato's mysticism, and he essentially broke from Plato, set up a rival school to the school of Plato's. And in fact, his school, interestingly, was called the Peripatetic school. The Peripatetic school in Athens is named that as a Greek word for peripatetic, means to walk about. And it was named for Aristotle's habit of walking and pacing as he taught. Now, when I preach, I stand behind the pulpit and I stand still. I don't move around a whole lot. But when I teach, for whatever reason, I have a hard time standing still. And right now, standing in front of this camera is a challenge for me. I want to move. I want to walk around. But anyway, enough about me. Aristotle wrote the Rhetoric, which you'll be reading this year, and essentially, as we understand it, is probably a compilation of his lecture notes. In his book, chapter 2, he gives his definition of rhetoric, which he defines as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Aristotle argued that it is not a special area of study. Gorgias said that rhetoric is the art of persuasion in courts of law and other assemblies. So he believed that rhetoric was limited to the courtroom. Aristotle said it was not. He disagreed with that. He said, in fact, that it's something that all men use. He said, in answer to Socrates' objections, he said that rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. That dialectic, which is logic, enables us to identify the arguments that will work and argue reasonably. Rhetoric enables us to express those arguments in a winsome and compelling fashion. He said that enthymemes alone are the substance of rhetorical persuasion. Now you're going to have to learn what an enthymeme is. Essentially, an enthymeme is a syllogism with a part left out. I know that was helpful. A syllogism would be a formal argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's a syllogism. An enthymeme would say, all men are mortal, so Socrates is mortal. It would skip that middle step because your mind is able to make that connection. That's an enthymeme, a syllogism with a part left out. He said that enthymemes alone are the substance of rhetorical persuasion, that the enthymeme in rhetoric is the syllogism in logic, and I know, we lost you now. But nonetheless, you're going to get to read that later on, and hopefully I'll have some more time to explain this to you later. That's not the purpose of this particular lecture. He tried to discover general rules for rhetoric that would work in any situation. The bulk of the first 2 books of his Rhetoric, which you'll be reading, is dedicated to invention, just the discovery of available arguments. And then his last book focuses more on arrangement and style and so on. The last era of rhetoric is the Roman era, or not the last, I mean, we're in an era of rhetoric right now. But the last of the history that I want to cover here in class is the Roman era, the Roman period of rhetoric. There's not really an identifiable emphasis of that era. But the key figures are, first of all, Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BC in Rome. He was a statesman and a writer, I believe, part of the Roman Senate. And in fact, as I understand it, was assassinated at the order of Mark Antony. He was Rome's greatest orator. He wrote 7 works on rhetoric, which you read about in the passage that you're reading in Corbett's book. He said, wisdom without eloquence has been of little help to the state, but eloquence without wisdom has often been a great obstacle and never an advantage. He taught that the aim of the orator is to discover how to convince the persons whom he wishes to persuade and how to arouse their emotions. Really, Cicero and the Roman rhetoricians took Aristotle's rhetoric and polished it, perfected it. And Cicero is probably the most famous rhetorician. Not Aristotle was a teacher, but Cicero was a student and a user of rhetoric. There are several other books that came about during the Roman period. One of those, the most famous and the most available and the most useful, and you would be reading it if you weren't taking rhetoric, a year's worth of rhetoric in one semester. But hold on, 5 seconds and we're going to pause. We'll stop right now.